I think it's safe to say that the MCU is probably the most popular movie franchise of all time right now, and I can kind of see why. Not just because if it's an awesome universe full of characters and memorable sequences and just mind-blowing action set pieces, but because of how perfectly Kevin Feige perfectly placed these sequences and overweaved into different universes and films, and making these films connect in a convincing way to make the MCU strong. And since Phase 4 is going into a different wacky and crazy situation, it's kind of weird to look back how the MCU started back when it did indeed start, of summer of 2008 with the very first Iron Man. And that's the film we're going to be talking about today, as we look back to see, is the first Iron Man film still one of the best, as we discuss Iron Man.
I put in harm's way.
A man with a dozen of these can rule all of Asia.
Now, before I give you guys my thoughts, let me know your guys' thoughts down in the comments section below. Do you love this film? Do you think it's overrated? What are your guys' thoughts on this film? Let's have a fun live discussion about this movie. So without further ado, let's get into it. So basically, Iron Man is a movie that was a film that easily could have been a complete utter disaster. Not just the film started production without a full completed script, not just the star Robert Downey Jr. having problems from the late 90s and early 2000s, but really this film could have easily been a colossal disappointment, because Kevin Feige was writing on this film to set up his universe. But what works so well of Iron Man for me is because, well, basically, this film does not hint, besides the end credit scene where we do meet Samuel Jackson's Nick Fury, this film does not tease or hint or set up any future film in the MC, which I think is really smart. So if this film did indeed bomb and there was no other MCU film, you could still watch this film and think that's still a really good film on its own. And I feel like for most of the MCU films, they've still kept that mannerism and that streak going, that, yeah, this is still a really good film, even though it's in a cinematic universe. I feel like some films, they kind of ride that train that, oh, this is a cinematic universe, so if you don't really like the universe, you really like the film. But I know a lot of people who don't really care for the MCU that still really do enjoy this movie, and still really do enjoy what Jon Favreau, the director and the producer Kevin Feige, did with this movie, because this movie just right off from the get-go just puts you into this film. Robert Downey Jr. is cruising off with some military men, and then just boom, we're just thrown into an insane, pretty brutal action sequence. And despite this opening, the MCU is really grounded in this film. It's kind of really weird to look back at these early MCU films, to go to MCU now that's comedic, funny, but still has the emotional weight. This film still has its quick comedic one-liners and quick dialogue, as Robert Downey Jr. is great on delivering, but the film is more serious and gritty with a lot of things in terms of its interpretation, because like when Tony Stark is kind of walking around these terrorists, he doesn't really quip a lot of jokes. He's very serious, he's very stern, and I feel like if this was made back when the MCU was all super comedic and funny, he would probably make a couple jokes, but he realized that that's not this is not a time to joke. And I love from the opening of this film, where we flash back to like 12 hours later or something, and we see earlier, and then we see Tony Stark like gambling and just having a good old time and just messing around, and then we see later on in the film that he progresses, he matures, he learns what he needs to do, and he learns that he needs to do this with his life, and he learns basically responsibility. And I think it's a really good character arc for the character of Robert Downey Jr. Let's talk about Robert Downey Jr. in this film. This was a breakout role for him, really. Like, he was in Chaplin and other films that he was really good in, like other films, but this film really put him into stardom, to becoming one of the most paid actors in the world. And since, because of that drug addiction I talked about in the beginning of this video, from the late 90s and early 2000s, he could really put himself into this film, and it made sense. His performance is so great, it's so witty. He's so good at just taking a piece of dialogue and going so many different ways. He can go so many different directions with pieces of dialogue in pretty much each and every sequence, especially since there was barely a script. There's a lot of improv in this film, and Robert Downey Jr. is basically like the king of improv. He's so great at improv, and he's so funny here. He's like he just says his lines with such a perfect tone and a perfect speed to it. The rest of the cast is also really good. I do enjoy Pepper and Tony's relationship in this film from the beginning, and how it kind of starts as just a work business that Pepper just kind of works for Tony, doesn't see much of it, and then by the end of the film, it's kind of a more love angle that they decide to take it, and it's such a great direction and such a great arc for these characters, the way they just throw it on into there. And it works extremely well throughout this movie, and it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel just kind of randomly out of left field. And the rest of the cast, from Jeff Bridges as the villain, is definitely good. I'm not going to say he's the best villain of the MCU. Definitely not. But I think in terms of Phase 1, he's definitely the third best villain behind Red Skull, and of course behind Loki from the Avengers film. But I would say Jeff Bridges is really great in the first 2 acts, but by the 3rd act, he just becomes a kind of a screaming lunatic, and there's not really much for him in this film to do in terms of character-wise. Like, he's a pretty interesting character, I guess, but they don't really give him much motivation or really, like, why he would want to do this. Yeah, Tony shuts down the weapons program, but why does he really want to build weapons? Just kind of get money? So if his motivation is just money, it's a really weak motivation. I think they really, like, lacklustered and started the MCU villains off on a pretty low and pretty weak basic. In this film in particular, it just kind of starts off a bit weak. The film is just a great way on how to make a starting of a franchise that absolutely works. Again, as I talked about in the beginning of this video, this movie does not set up anything, does not set up any future films, besides the post-credit sequence, which back in 2008 was probably, like, absolutely mind-blowing. Like, people who knew these characters from the comics were probably just blown out of their minds to see this. And also, what makes this film so good is Kevin Feige, the producer, and Jon Favreau, the director, had an impossible task to put a unknown character in to make this, because Spider-Man was with Sony, and X-Men and Fox with the Fantastic Four, so Marvel really had their known characters, and it's weird to think that back in 2008, Hulk, Captain America, Iron Man, all these characters were such an unknown, and now they're everywhere nowadays. It's a weird thing to kind of go, it's kind of like you're just kind of going, like, back in time when you watch these type of films, and they had to make sure that this film was as good as it possibly could be. The action sequences in this film, I think, are really exceptional. The first action sequence, as the opening of the film I've talked about, but when Tony gets out of the cave and the only thing that doesn't really work for me in terms of the action is the finale. I'm not gonna say it's awful or anything, but the finale kind of has, it's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit lackluster. It kind of becomes a typical superhero movie of characters bashing into each other and just kind of fiddling with things. It's a bit strange, and I'm not gonna say it's awful, but I'm not gonna say it's like high caliber anyway. So I say just the action sequences, they're really well filmed, really well shot. The visuals in this film, still to this very day, almost 13 years later, still hold up to this day. And I feel like the Iron Man suits, they feel heavy, they feel like they have some weight. Starting at Civil War, the costumes, or I guess the suits, they feel like they don't have weight to them. They kind of feel like they weigh nothing, and they feel a bit shoddy, and they feel a bit CG. And these first set of films that Iron Man appears in, they feel heavy. They feel like when he hits somebody or blasts somebody with his repulsor blast, it feels like it hurts, and it feels like it has weight to them. Something I feel like the later Iron Man films, or just the later films that Iron Man appears in, just kind of lackluster, and I don't really think it works as well as I think I would want it to, or I think as well as it could. The music is also great, not just AC/DC, but the main theme. The movie's pacing is really well. The film's quite funny. This is before Marvel kind of like full-on went to their comedy roots, but this is a very funny, really funny movie that just kind of has that quick, witty humor. And since this film could have been really bad, not having a full-on script, not really knowing where to take this film, but I feel like they did a fantastic job dealing with this film. And also, this film has quite a bit of emotional moments as well. Nothing like tear-jerking or anything, but still a lot of moments where you can be like, you know, that's sweet. And this film, I feel like a lot of people, MCU fans, would, if you like, grew up watching the MCU, or you just started watching the newer MCU films and you go back to this, I feel like people would find this film very boring. There's not a lot of action sequences, there's not a lot of humor, there's not a lot of fast-paced movie. This movie's pacing is a lot like the first act of Avengers Endgame, which that was people's main complaint about Avengers Endgame, was that first act. It's more slower with a little bit of action beats, a little bit of story. This film is not focused on when can we get to the Iron Man suit, or when can we get to Iron Man, when can we get to the next action sequence. That's not what this film was focusing on. They knew if they really wanted to make a really good Iron Man film, they knew they needed to make a film that was about Tony Stark and his problems and his redemption and his arc throughout the film. I absolutely love the ending of this film where he does admit his true identity. It's a simple thing, but there's so many superheroes that know their true identity. And I guess nowadays in the MCU, it's not a big surprise that basically no hero nowadays in the MCU has their secret identity being kept a secret. It's just out in the open. My main problem with this movie is the third act. Jeff Bridges as the villain. Why really good performance-wise, and I love the actor. Just kind of goes crazy for apparently no apparent reason. And the third act does really fall off. CGI-wise, it doesn't look as good as it used to. Performances are a bit weird, and it just kind of feels like a slacked on and just kind of like they had really good first two acts, and then like, oh crap, we need a third act. Let's just have a generic final fight, and I think they could have really improved it, and I think the MCU has really definitely improved it with their later MCU movies. This film is just great from start to finish. There's great moments, funny characters, interesting, besides the third act not being as good as it was and lackluster, but this film's setting up a universe so well without really setting up a universe. And that post-credit scene, man, it was just too good. I'm gonna give Iron Man 2008 an A. I think it's a really phenomenal, terrific movie. It does not get my perfect grade though, because I do have some problems with the pacing a bit, and in the third act, just being very lackluster and not as good as it could be. So there's my thoughts on Iron Man. What do you think of this film? I'll let you know what people think about this film. Do you think it's still high standard, high MCU, or do you think it's more in the lower spectrum of the MCU? I would love to know your guys' opinion on this. If you guys are new to the channel and you love movie content, geeky content, reviews, trailer reactions, a whole bunch of awesome like that, rankings, you guys can click that subscribe button and hit the post notification bell so you guys never want to upload another video on this channel. And if you guys can also like this video, if I want to see my more thoughts on this with another person, I do run a podcast called the Movie View Podcast. I do every other Tuesday. We talk about movies, trailers, news, topics, mini reviews. It's a whole bunch of fun. And you guys can also check out my Instagram at JonesForDaniel77. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys next time. General out.